Welcome to the Indian Council of World Affairs, India's oldest foreign policy think tank.
Many people interested in foreign policy have told me when they come to the Indian Council of World Affairs in Sapru House, they feel a great sense of affinity with this institution because this was where the serious study of international relations in India all began.
The ICWA was set up by a small group of public intellectuals some years before our independence because they felt it important that India have an independent perspective on international affairs. Since then, the ICWA has gone from strength to strength, and it has been a long journey, almost 75 years. One particular milestone in that journey was in 2001, when the Indian Parliament passed an act declaring the ICWA to be an institution of national importance. We thus became a publicly funded independent think tank. Our governing council is headed by the Vice President of India, and the External Affairs Minister is its Vice President. We have three focus areas. The first is research, which is carried out by an in-house faculty. Very rigorous research on different parts of the world, encompassing the domain of area studies.
The Council has been very proactive in conducting dialogue and discussion on African affairs and India-Africa relations in order to promote an understanding on African affairs in India, an Indian perspective on Africa, given the priority that now Africa has in Indian foreign policy.
Within the Council, we have a renewed focus on Latin America and the Caribbean region. So we're looking through our studies to find new areas of cooperation such as renewable energy, climate change and the space technology.
Interacting with leading experts, diplomats, media persons and academicians has helped me nurture my research further.
We recently had the ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook, which has a lot of convergence with the India's own Indo-Pacific construct.
The learning curve at the Council has been tremendous and it provides a strong foundation for my future research.
The second is policy. Because we are a think tank, and being close to policy, commenting on policy, and helping formulate policy is an essential part of our functioning.
I think in the new age, what we're seeing much more of is that people want to be involved in foreign policy thinking. They want to have a voice. Now this is where ICWA comes in.
This is the platform where I for many years have come and interacted with the best in the world.
ICWA provides a valued platform for visiting foreign dignitaries to interact with informed Indian audiences. The third is outreach. This is most important because of our role as a public-funded independent think tank, and we carry this out by associating ourselves with as wide an audience in India as is possible. Colleges, universities, other think tanks, and of course with similar institutions elsewhere in the world.
What I would call the democratization of Indian foreign policy. It has moved to distant corners of the country. It is no longer a preserve of Delhi.
ICWA has a robust publications program which includes papers by the in-house faculty, invited papers and commentaries, and books on foreign affairs by not only former diplomats and established academics but also by upcoming scholars. Our journal, India Quarterly, is being published since 1945. ICWA's publications are also being translated into various Indian languages. What is ICWA's role as we move into the future? The vision of the institution is to stay abreast of all the momentous changes taking place in the domain of foreign policy. New areas are emerging. There are strategic technologies, there is climate change, there is artificial intelligence, and there is cybersecurity. How can our research faculty and the audiences that come here be better informed about developments in these areas? How can we write and formulate research papers to give policy inputs that help in government policy formulation? These are the emerging challenges for ICWA and form a part of our vision for the future.
A very good afternoon to everybody. On behalf of ICWA, the Indian Council of World Affairs, I welcome you all to today's program, ICWA-NIAS combined book launch and discussion of 4 recent publications of the NIAS Calcutta. In the panel today, we have the introductory remarks by Director General ICWA, Dr. T.C.A. Raghavan. In the chair's role, we have Professor Suranjan Das. Professor Das is currently Vice Chancellor, Jadavpur University and Honorary Director, Netaji Institute for Asian Studies, Kolkata. He is also the Honorary Professor at the University of Exeter, UK. He was a Professor of History at the University of Calcutta and served at the institution both as a Pro-Vice Chancellor and Vice Chancellor of the University of Kolkata. Among the panelists, we are privileged to have the following today. Ambassador Ashok Mukherjee. Ambassador Mukherjee served for over 37 years in the Indian Foreign Service, retiring as India's ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations in New York in 2015. He has held diplomatic assignments in London, Moscow, Washington, D.C., Geneva, Almaty, Dubai, Tashkent, and Belgrade. At headquarters, he was a special secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs dealing with political issues, including counterterrorism, cyber diplomacy, broad border management, and India's foreign policy research and communication. Currently, Dr. Mukherjee on the faculty of Diplo Foundation, established by the government of Malta at Switzerland. There's several published studies. Ambassador Vivek was a member of the Indian Foreign Service from 1954 to 2005. India's missions in Washington, serving political and gang wars. He was ambassador of India to South Korea in 1985.
Could you come a little closer to the mic? And if you have a second device on, switch it off. There's a faint echo.
I hope I'm clearer now.
Yeah.
Yes. Sorry for that technical glitch. He was ambassador to Indonesia from 1994 to 98 and also worked closely with ASEAN headquarters in Jakarta. Served as Secretary Minister in 2001. 2009 to 12, he served as the Director General of the Council of World Affairs. At present, he is the Chairman of the Society for Indian Social Studies. Bhattacharya has been ambassador to Myanmar and Mexico and as High Commissioner for Kenya, South Africa, and Lesotho. He is a distinguished fellow of Foreign Policy Studies program in Vietnam. T.C.A. International Advisory Council, State Policy Africa Committee. He is also and has served as the chair of core group of experts International. As the Director General of the Indian Council of World Affairs, his third book, which is in the making, deals with India-Africa relations. Next, we have Professor Matu, is a professor at Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament in the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and concurrently serves as the Honorary Professor of International Relations at the Faculty of Arts, University of Melbourne. Professor Matu has also chaired the Knowledge Initiative with the Education Minister of Jammu and Kashmir and has also been a member of National Security Council's Advisory Board. He was awarded the Padma Shri for his contribution to education and public life. Next, we have Dr. Sitaram Sharma, who is Honorary Consul of Republic of Belarus in Calcutta and Vice President, Indian Federation of United Nations Associations in New Delhi. He is also the Vice President Strategy of Center for Eastern and Northeastern Regional Studies in Calcutta and Editorial Advisor of the Business Economics Board of Governor Institute for Inspiration and Self-Development. Lastly, we have Professor Sarvani Gooptu, who is a Professor of Asian Literary and Cultural Studies at the Netaji Institute for Asian Studies in Calcutta. Previously, she worked for 20 years in the Department of History, Calcutta Girls College. Her main areas of research are nationalism, culture, and colonial and post-colonial period. She has several published books. With this, may I now invite the Director General, ICWA, Dr. T.C.A. Raghavan, for his initial remarks. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Vivek, and may I begin by welcoming all of you and thanking all of you who are with us today. It's a great privilege for the Indian Council of World Affairs to be associated with the Netaji Institute for Asian Studies in launching these 4 books, and I'm very grateful to Professor Suranjan Das for associating the ICWA with this book launch. May I also welcome him to this panel, as also other colleagues, Ambassador Ashok Mukherjee, Ambassador Sudhir Devre, Professor Amitabh Mattu, Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia, Shri Sitaram Sharma, and Dr. Sarvani Gooptu. I should remark that both Ambassadors Sudhir Devre and Rajiv Bhatia have been associated with the Indian Council of World Affairs as Director General. So, in a sense, this is a real ICWA presence here. Vivek Mishra, who is Research Fellow in the Indian Council of World Affairs, is a co-author of 2 of the 4 books being launched. And Ambassador Ashok Mukherjee is doing a regular feature for the ICWA on India's membership of the UN Security Council. So we have many associations with the ICWA, and I should not forget to mention Professor Amitabh Mattu, who was a regular in all our ICWA programs when we used to meet in Sapru House, but otherwise has a far older association with this council than many of us who have joined it in the past 2 decades or decade and a half, and I speak also for Ambassador Devre. But Professor Mattu, as an alumni of the School of International Studies, has a strong claim on the council and knows a great deal about it. So it's a great pleasure and an honor for us to be associated with this event, and I'll be very brief because there are other speakers who have substantive contributions to make. But may I congratulate you, Professor Suranjan Das, for these 4 books and this important role which the Netaji Institute for Asian Studies is playing in this regard. I think we sometimes tend to overlook Netaji's own conception of the Asian order, and one of the big what-ifs of history is that what would have been India's view of Asia if Netaji had not died tragically in that air crash and had lived on and made a contribution to India post decolonization. So I think it's a useful reminder whenever we associate with the Netaji Institute about that great what if of our history. I would also like to congratulate you, Professor, on these books, because I haven't read all of them, but I did read India's relations with Indonesia, the historical introduction, and it's a kind of a primer. And I really would like to congratulate you on this initiative, because some of us, when we get deeply engrossed into foreign policy issues, we often overlook the need for primers or for reaching out and being accessible to a wider public opinion, which may not be specialists, but are at the same time have a serious interest. And I think this book is an excellent example of the kind of thing which much more of. In the ICWA last year, we also started on this project of coming out with books on countries with which we have had relations for a long period of time, and coming out with a small booklet, not so much for the scholarly reader, but for the lay reader, or for the serious, interested, but still lay reader. And we are coming out with a volume on India and Bangladesh. But really, I should congratulate you on this book on Indonesia, because it will certainly act as a template for the Council for future publications. So with these remarks, may I again congratulate all the authors and the joint authors, and also the Netaji Institute for Asian Studies, as also my fellow panelists, for joining us and giving us this opportunity of hearing you on these subjects. Thank you very much.
May I now invite the chair, Professor Suranjan Das, to conduct the proceedings. So kindly unmute yourself.
Thank you. No? Is okay? Thank you. Honorable Director General of Indian Council of World Affairs, Ambassador Raghavan, distinguished panelists, and esteemed participants. Could I say a very big thank you to ICWA, especially to Ambassador Raghavan, who has always encouraged new ideas and new academic exercises, and also to Vivek for organizing this book launch on virtual mode today. It is indeed a privilege for me to share the panel with such distinguished personalities with whom I had the good fortune of working in some stage of my career. We have Ambassadors Ashok Mukherjee, Sudhir Davare, and Rajiv Bhatia, all of whom have demonstrated a remarkable combination of intellectual acumen and diplomatic insights in their writings and interventions. I particularly recall Ambassador Mukherjee's valuable guiding hand when, with the help of late Sri Pranab Mukherjee, I had taken the initiative of establishing the Institute of Foreign Policy Studies at the University of Calcutta. With Ambassadors Devare and Bhatia, I had the very good fortune to serve the Indian Council of World Affairs as a governing council member, and I fondly recall the intense discussions we had in promoting the cause of the ICWA. Mr. Sitaram Sharma, the moving spirit behind the United Nations associations in India, and under whose dynamic chairmanship I served as a member of the Executive Council, the Maulana Azad Institute for Asian Studies in Kolkata. There is Vivek Mishra, who had been my colleague at the Netaji Institute for Asian Studies and currently at ICWA, and there is Sarvani Gooptu, my former student, and who continues to be an active member of the Netaji Institute's faculty. And of course, we have Professor Amitabh Mattu, the front-ranking foreign policy analyst of a country who has a rare distinction of being the youngest vice-chancellor of the country and also the rare distinction of being the youngest recipient of the Padma Shri Award. And he is someone with whom since our wonderful Oxford days, we have remained very close friends, and he has remained a source of our inspiration and sustenance. I shan't take much of your time since we are eagerly waiting and looking forward to hearing the distinguished panelists. And as Ambassador Raghavan pointed out, it is in the rare occasion that we have in one forum such a galaxy of experts. Let me just make one point, and that is, how do I visualize the importance of this event? I see it in the context of a growing realization that regional voices need to be heard at the national level on various aspects of Indian foreign policy. When we were students, we had the received wisdom that Indian foreign policy is a realm which has reflected a broad, homogeneous understanding across the country, except on one or two temporary events. However, now although there continues to be a consensus on the broad parameters of Indian foreign policy, but within this framework, there are regional perceptions which need to be taken into consideration to enrich the broad framework of convergence in the realm of formulating and practicing Indian foreign policy. And ICWA has been providing an excellent platform for sharing studies on Indian foreign policy that have been carried out outside the contours of the national capital. Now in Kolkata, we have a small social science research institute sponsored by the Higher Education Department of the Government of West Bengal. And here we conduct on what may be called, as Ambassador Raghavan reminded us of, Netaji's perceptions of Asian studies, Asian relations, and also on aspects of India's involvement with world politics. In the last few years, our institute, with the support of research grants for the Government of West Bengal, has been involved with researches in three broad areas. The first is India's bilateralism in the perspective of earlier Lucas policy and currently the Actis policy, and the policy briefs or the primers that Ambassador Raghavan mentioned on Indo-Vietnam and India-Indonesian relations that are to be launched today need to be viewed in this context. In these policy briefs, or the primers as Ambassador Raghavan pointed out, we have tried to unfold the major shifts and turns of India's relationships with the two countries in historical context and historical perspectives, and have also tried to identify the potentials of further enrichment of the two constructive bilateralisms, highlighting possible role that West Bengal can play in the process. The second area of research was the one that was initiated to commemorate 70 years of India's association with the United Nations organization, which resulted in the publication of the 2-volume compendium on India and the United Nations General Assembly, where we tried to bring together speeches of the leaders of the country's delegations to the UNGA from 1946 to 2018 and sought to contextualize them in a detailed introduction within specific UN interventions in world politics and the changing contours of UN working. The project could not have been completed without the constant support of the West Bengal Federation of United Nations Associations, and we are now working on documenting India's role in the Security Council, and here we are greatly falling back on the ICWA guest column contributions from Ambassador Ashok Mukherjee on India in the Security Council. The third research area in our institute is maritime security, which has been reflected in the volume to be released today, which brings together contributions on Indian maritime strategy in the Indian Ocean region. I leave it to the editors of the volume, Vivek and Sarvani, to explicate the themes addressed in the volume. Let me conclude with what I would call a pertinent quote from the former UN Security General Ban Ki-moon on the expectations of the world community, of the global community from India, and I quote, "The whole world is watching India. India is a major regional and global power. I urge you to continue to champion the causes of democracy, the rule of law, and good governance. I would like to see even stronger Indian support for the United Nations efforts to peacefully resolve conflict," unquote. We do look forward to India fulfilling this hope and expectation. And to ensure this, as I see it, we need to move on, keeping the federal spirit intact and developing a policy structure and perspective that accommodates the multiple pluralist perceptions of the Indian society. And if we can do that, I'm sure India will fulfill the global expectations as had been outlined by the former Security Council General Secretary General that I have just quoted. With these words, could I once again thank the ICWA and the distinguished panelists who have joined to release the volumes, and I also thank and express my gratitude to the participants who have joined this particular forum, which I'm sure will be academically most fruitful. Thank you very much indeed. Could I now request Ambassador Mukherjee, Ambassador Devade, Professor Amita Mattu, Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia, and Mr. Sitaram Sharma to jointly release online the 4 books. Thank you. It is now my very great pleasure and privilege to request Ambassador Ashok Mukherjee to provide us with his observations and critical assessments on the book India and the United Nations General Assembly, which have been jointly edited by me, Vivek Mishra, and Mr. Sitaram Sharma. Ambassador Mukherjee, please.
Thank you, Professor Suranjan Das. I would like to thank Director General ICWA Ambassador Raghavan, you, Professor Das, and Dr. Vivek Mishra for inviting me to this book launch today. I am especially happy to note that you, Professor Das, are continuing to show your great interest and activity in India's foreign policy, including in India's multilateral foreign policy. I note the role played by the West Bengal Federation of United Nations Associations of India, and I hope that their involvement in this project, and especially in this book, will portend active contribution to the ongoing debate on India and the United Nations, which has been given an impulse by our Prime Minister's call for reformed multilateralism. The two-volume book that we have released today on India in the United Nations General Assembly is a major contribution to both scholars of international relations as well as practitioners. It brings together in a compact form India's main vision of what the United Nations means for India. Obviously, a lot of research has gone into this compilation, and as the succinct 64-page introduction to the book emphasizes, India has played a significant role in giving substance to the work of the United Nations during the past 75 years. India has also contributed to steering the orientation of the United Nations, especially in its socio-economic activities, towards issues of primary concern to individual citizens of developing countries who today account for as many as 134 member states of the 193-member UN General Assembly. The introduction rightly stresses some of the key moments of this historical record. I like the prominence given to the first speech by India at the 1946 first session of the General Assembly because it encapsulates from the very beginning how India looks at the United Nations. This vision integrated the UN's role in ensuring peace and security so that, and I quote, we the peoples, unquote, would be able to achieve our objectives of socio-economic development. Implementing this vision requires effective international cooperation. In September 1947, just after achieving her own independence from colonial rule, India drew a blueprint of what this socio-economic development meant for India. India's view, articulated by Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, the leader of the Indian delegation, was, and I quote, ideology is less important than practice. We cannot eat an ideology. We cannot brandish an ideology and feel that we are clothed and housed. Food, clothing, shelter, education, medical services, these are the things we need. We know that we can only obtain them by our own joint efforts as a people and with the help and cooperation of those who are in more fortunate circumstances than ourselves, unquote. The vindication of this view has come 70 years later when Prime Minister Modi joined world leaders at the UN General Assembly in September 2015 to adopt Agenda 2030 with its 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Today, Agenda 2030 is the universally agreed framework for the future of the United Nations and of multilateralism. The primary impediment for the United Nations objective of ensuring peace and security was also foreseen in India's statement in 1946. The current breakdown in peace and security across the world, which is highlighted in India's statement in the General Assembly last year, is directly attributable to the veto privilege of the 5 permanent members or P5 of the Security Council. Over 80 million people today have been impacted due to the malfunctioning of the Security Council, leading to calls for its urgent reforms. This reform must come from amending the UN Charter. In 1946, India expressed disquiet at the compromise decision forced on the original founding members by the major military powers in agreeing to the veto provisions of Article 27 of the Charter. Although India and other countries like Australia did not find the veto acceptable, they agreed to include it in the Charter to keep the major military powers inside the framework of multilateral diplomacy. This was based on the explicit understanding referred to by the leader of India's delegation in 1946, Sir Ramaswamy Mudalia, that in 10 years' time, the review of the Charter's provisions would be conducted and the veto power would be reviewed specifically in that context. Unfortunately, somewhere along the way, during the past 7 decades, the international community seems to have lost this vision and forgotten this commitment. It is only now, following calls for reform multilateralism in 2020, that the implementation of the provision of the Article 109 of the Charter to review its veto power of the P5 becomes relevant once again. Such cross-referencing of statements and realities facing the UN can be done and has been done in this book on several other important issues. These include non-discrimination, gender equality, decolonization, disarmament, and faith in the ideals of democracy, in countering terrorism, in peacekeeping and peace building, and the challenges faced by the global commons and so on. I would like to conclude by referring to Prime Minister Modi's first statement to the UN General Assembly in 2014, which is printed on page 646 of the book, in which he called for the UN to declare 21 June every year as the International Day of Yoga. It is not often that a practitioner is able to implement such a proposal during his or her assignment in a multilateral framework in which the interests of 193 member states need to converge to give substance to an idea. The fact that I was able to lead our efforts and our team in New York to implement this proposal within a record period of 75 days with 177 co-sponsoring countries on 11 December 2014 was a marker of India's ability to use multilateralism to enrich mankind through an idea whose time had come. That for me is one reason why this book we are launching today is so important. The book contains ideas as well as positions taken by India at the United Nations. I hope we will be able to distill these ideas and weave them into creating what Dr. Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan used to refer to as, and I quote, the unity of mankind, unquote, which must remain the raison d'etre for multilateral cooperation. Thank you.
Ambassador Mukherjee, we do look forward to receiving your help while completing our next volume on India and the Security Council. Thank you very much for those comments and those encouraging words. Could I now request Ambassador Sudhir Devare to kindly speak on the book on India and Indonesia, which myself and another colleague of mine, Subhadeep and Tridib, and also Tridib Chakraborti have written. Ambassador Devare, please.
Thank you, Suranjan. It's always a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you very much.
Though it is digital, I think it gives me great happiness. First of all, I think we are in the midst of very homely gathering. ICWA and NIAS, a number of our colleagues from ICWA are participating in this very interesting venture, greatly underpinned by this intellectual activity coming from Kolkata in the form of creating so many books at the same time. Well, I would like to first compliment Professor Suranjan Das and his colleague Subhadeep Bhattacharya for this brilliant chronologically put together survey of India and Indonesia. The landscape of these two countries is so vast that I really marvel how you were able to put it together in mere 94 pages. And as Raghavan said earlier, this is a kind of a template, a primer, when even a complex subject is put in such a fashion that it can be read by laymen. A complicated subject need not be that difficult and so lengthy. So I think this is a kind of approach which is very important in putting together books of this kind, which will be appreciated and also read by larger number of people. These days people don't like to read much, so I think the shorter the book but more succinctly put, I think it has great value. Talking about India and Indonesia, well, right from the time I went there almost more than 25 years ago, that relationship has both fascinated me as well as puzzled me, as it has to many of my colleagues, either in the panel or outside. Two countries with such vast population, India and Indonesia among the first three countries in Asia, both syncretic culture, populations, of course, large, the leading countries in SAARC as well as in ASEAN. I think no two countries probably have so many things in common as India and Indonesia have. Whether it is history, whether it is the cultural background, whether the historical colonial past, our fight for freedom, and both are today developing countries, developing societies, and with very vibrant and noisy democracies. We have, of course, had ups and downs in our relationship, and you have, in your book, brought that out very appropriately. We have now comprehensive strategic partnership between India and Indonesia. On the surface, it appears that the countries are doing very well. But as I said, I always feel some kind of enigma when it comes to Indonesia. And so do the Indonesians when we talk to them. We are neighbors, only 160 kilometers between Aceh and Nicobar Islands. And yet we know so little about each other. And in terms of actually activity, the level of activity I'm talking of today, again, more or less the same. This is despite the fact that in the early years, the first 10, 15 years of India's independence, there was immense activity between India and Indonesia. In fact, as the ICWA itself witnessed, at the first Asian Relations Conference, Pandit Nehru was very anxious that the Prime Minister of Indonesia attended it, because Indonesia was among the two countries which were independent at that time. And throughout the first 15 years, the interaction, political interaction, social, cultural interaction between the two countries was really at a height. Be it as it may, today the relationship may appear to be on even keel, but I still feel that our mutual stakes don't appear to be inextricably linked to each other. And I would like to just, in view of the paucity of time, just touch upon 5 or 6 aspects or points relating to Indonesia. What are our perceptions about Indonesia and perhaps their perceptions about India? 1, democracy. I think the onset of democracy in Indonesia has not been fully understood or appreciated. It is one of the most remarkable developments of the ending years of the 20th century, when in 1998 there was almost a bloodless coup in Indonesia, and a military regime which was in power for more than 30 years came to an end. Over the years, the Indonesians are in fact evolving further their democratic setup. They have democratic decentralization as far as the financial powers go. Nowadays, there are regular elections every year in Indonesia. Indonesia is one of the few countries in ASEAN which are democracy. And in fact, after the Myanmar coup in February this year, Indonesia, though currently is not the chairman of ASEAN, seem to be taking initiative in trying to find a political solution to the problem in Myanmar. So I think the commitment to democracy, which has really been only 20 years now in Indonesia, is already seen to be fairly deep and people-oriented. Another question which arises about Indonesia is the rise of political Islam. There has been, in last 15-20 years, considerable increase in Wahhabism in Indonesia, the impact of political Islam, jihadism. Even in elections, there are political parties which are completely Islamic, and that raises the fear, not only in Southeast Asia but across the world, whether this is the largest Muslim country of Southeast Asia, is it going to be radical Islamist? I think this is a phenomenon which we all need to study very carefully. And as we see it more, we try to analyze it and try to see it deeper, we find that the traditions of moderation and tolerance, which have been the hallmark of Indonesian society for hundreds of years, are still alive and kicking in that country. And the policies which the present president has followed in the last few years, there have been, of course, criticism also 3-4 years ago, but by and large, keeping this country's that secular tradition alive. The existence of two major NGOs, I think those who have followed Indonesia perhaps are aware, called Nahdlatul Ulama and Muhammadiyah. These two NGOs with about 60 and 20 million membership in that country. Nearly half of the country has membership in these two bodies. They have been constantly trying for the last 60-70 years to maintain the fabric of this country more secular. And I think with this kind of background that country has, we will need to see how conditions towards political Islam evolve or are kept in check. Third is China factor in Indonesia. I think in the last 10-15 years, in fact, across Southeast Asia, the Sino-US rivalry has been one of the main concerns. In fact, the influence of US was seen to be declining and that of China to be rising. And how does that play out in a country of Indonesia's size and a country which is not geographically proximate to China? And particularly in the context of the South China Sea issue, which has been dominating the political scene in that region, where does Indonesia fit in? Indonesia's North Natuna Sea zone falls, that is the exclusive economic zone, is claimed by China. And that is the contention between China and Indonesia. In the last 3-4 years, there have been a number of incidents in which this Indonesian sovereignty has been violated by China. There have been, in fact, incidents in which the Indonesians destroyed Chinese Coast Guard ship, Chinese vessels, fishing vessels, and so on. So there is a problem between them. On one hand, that problem continues. On the other hand, Indonesia adopts a nuanced approach, kind of a approach of hedging between Indonesia and China. And while Indonesia has a fairly strong, non-aligned, neutral approach of dealing with the region, including on the South China Sea issue in the region, Indonesia took the Sinopharm vaccine immediately. Indonesia is also a member of, has also agreed to be working with China on the BRI. So you have a relationship between the two large countries of Asia, which is not white or black, it is somewhere in gray. And this is the kind of approach which a large country like Indonesia looks like following. In the US-China rivalry, again, Indonesia has taken a neutral line. In fact, on the question of Indo-Pacific, the Indonesians, after considerable deliberation within ASEAN, finally took the initiative and came out with the Indo-Pacific outlook of ASEAN. As you may be aware, a number of ASEAN countries were quite reluctant to have anything to do with Indo-Pacific because the Chinese do not accept Indo-Pacific, even the term Indo-Pacific. So it is the Indonesians which were finally able to craft this outlook. And earlier, in fact, their foreign minister was even proposing a treaty on Indo-Pacific. On one hand, they have done this. The Indonesians are quite, silent on this whole issue of Quad. They may have sympathies on the principles of Quad, but they are unlikely to be a member of the Quad Plus. The major policy initiative these days of the Indonesian president and the government is what is known as the Maritime Fulcrum. Indonesians are given priority to maritime security and maritime development, that being the main concerns for a country which is the largest archipelago in the world. And in this maritime concept, the Indonesians look forward to closer cooperation and collaboration with India. They believe that India has the wherewithal and the capacity to support Indonesian objectives of maritime fulcrum. And if India were to play the role of a security provider in the Indian Ocean and beyond, then a reliable and a credible partner would be a large country like Indonesia, which has similar concerns of security as well as blue economy, and there India and Indonesia can work together. In fact, there is a proposal of a project called Sabang project, which is not far from the Andaman Islands, and there are expectations from the Indonesians that India and Indonesia will work together to make that realistic. Lastly, ASEAN. Indonesia is the anchor of ASEAN. They have always taken a low profile in the context of ASEAN, and if the ASEAN would continue to be active and credible, I think the Indonesians will have to play a major role, and that they are conscious of that. And I think currently they are doing so. Now again, for India, for our look or act is policy, support of ASEAN is absolutely critical. And in that regard, India-Indonesia cooperation again becomes kind of an imperative. These are, I think, broad parameters of relationship between India and Indonesia. Of course, we have the growing trade, investments, people-to-people contacts, and of course, last but not the least, the cultural bonds between the two countries, which really transcend so many areas between the two. This is, I think, a relationship which has really, I would think, no ceiling. This can really grow faster and faster. And a book of this kind, which Dr. Suranjan Das and Professor Bhattacharya have brought out, I think it makes a very useful contribution for people to understand this, because Indonesia still remains a much underrated or less understood country, and the same can be said about India in Indonesia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Devare, for those words which you clearly outlined on the basis of your own experience in the archipelago. You have provided us with new entry points to have a fresh look at the volume, and perhaps we could incorporate some of those points when we publish a revised version of the volume, because the volume is fast running out and the publisher has asked us to think in terms of a revised edition. Thank you very much, Ambassador Devare. Here, may I make a point? I'm here reminded of a very pertinent point that Ambassador Bhatia made in connection with outlining India's relationship with East Asia, where in one of his articles he used the term balanced regional architecture that India needs to develop in developing its own East Asia. I think in developing this balanced regional architecture, culture becomes a very important aspect. The excellent initiative you took in 2016, organizing lectures on India's cultural links with Indonesia. You yourself delivered a lecture on optimizing India's Act East policy to promote India-Indonesia bilateral relations. On this occasion, a book was published by Hema Devare, Ganga in Mekong. On this occasion, he organized a reading by Amitav Ghosh. So this cultural ingredient in the development of regional architecture that Ambassador Bhatia mentioned, I think is very, very important. And I think the Indian foreign policy formulators need to take into account this particular point. Thank you very much, Ambassador Devare. It is now my very good pleasure and privilege to request Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia to give his views, observations, thoughts on the book entitled The Regional Great Game in the Indian Ocean and India's Evolving Maritime Strategy, which has been edited by Vivek Mishra and Sarvani Gooptu. Ambassador Bhatia, please. Ambassador Bhatia, you need to unmute.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Great. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Dr. Suranjan Das and Ambassador Raghavan. A very big thank you to you both for conceiving this wonderful and heartwarming event. I truly want to congratulate the leadership of the two host institutions, ICWA and NIAS, for this mega event. You know, these 4 publications really cover a very sizable spectrum of international relations. I also wish to extend my sincere congratulations to the distinguished editors and authors, as well as to the publishers who have toiled hard and long to reach the present milestone when their labors get due recognition by us, the real beneficiaries. Yes, indeed, I shall focus my observations on only one book, The Regional Great Game in the Indian Ocean and India's Evolving Maritime Strategy. This is edited by Vivek Mishra and Sarvani Gooptu, and I'm very happy that both of them are here and will speak. This book deals with what is perhaps the most significant and popular theme among academics, practitioners, and media alike who are interested in deciphering the complexities and stakes of the geopolitics of maritime Asia today. This theme has assumed greater salience in view of what the President of China stated yesterday as his nation celebrated the centenary of TCP. This particular book resulted from an academic conference hosted at the historic Netaji Bhavan in Kolkata in 2017. It comprises 11 essays. The titles of the chapters and the author's credentials reveal notable diversity. A careful perusal will undoubtedly be beneficial to anyone who is inquisitive about the current play of power politics in the Indo-Pacific region. The editors have done well by providing a detailed introduction summarizing the thesis of the various chapters and then adding the conclusion in an attempt to fill the time gap between the conference and the 2020 publication. I shall particularly commend a close reading of the chapter entitled The Roles, Rationale and Limits of India's Maritime Strategy by Admiral Arun Prakash, a former naval chief. He aptly defines the new great game that paints China in a quest of dominance, and that has the US, China, Japan, Russia, India, and Pakistan as the main players. I think a few European powers too need to be added to this mix. He predicts that this power play in Eurasia and the Indo-Pacific would remain a complex and highly contested test of wills between major powers. His valuable advice to India is to learn to play hardball and practice real politics, as well as to craft an overdue national strategy which focuses on India's neglected maritime domain. Quite a few initiatives have been taken in this regard in the past few years, but obviously we have a long way to go. There are other also very good chapters by young and experienced scholars. Due to time constraint, I cannot analyze all of them, but I would say that seen together, they present a very substantive and thought-provoking study of the subject. I may be allowed to offer one critical observation. The editors highlight India's strategic dilemma to desist from upsetting China and partnering with the US at the same time. Despite their deep insights, they, like other experts, could not anticipate the Galwan clash and the first ever Quad summit. So much has happened in course of the past 3 years, and particularly the past 1.5 years in this domain. The implications of recent developments from early 2020 to the present day make it amply clear, I think, that red lines are being drawn which are certain to further sharpen the strategic contestation in the Indian Ocean and Asia. My final point relates to President Xi Jinping's assertion on 1st July. I think we all have read and thought about it. He said, China has never bullied, oppressed, or subjugated the people of any other country and would never allow any foreign force to bully, oppress, or subjugate us. It is evident that the illusion of a foreign menace is being manufactured in order to bolster national unity and distract people's attention from the real problems they face. Besides, this assertion confirms that the gap between China's rhetoric and actions is widening speedily. A simple question presents itself. Is China being bullied, or is China bullying much of Asia today? Our sinologists have argued that China is now a great power. It thinks and behaves as one. True. But Asia desires to know if China will behave as a responsible power. The world's future in this decade may be shaped by the answer. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Bhatia, for those very incisive comments. Thank you very much, and I'm sure the editors will take note of them and perhaps incorporate some of them when a revised version of the book comes out. It is now my personal pleasure, a very personal pleasure, to request my very good friend and colleague, Professor Amitabh Mattu, to submit his observations, comments, and whatever term you use, Amitabh, on the book on India-Vietnam relations. Amitabh, we are looking forward to your comments. Thank you, Amitabh. Amitabh, can you mute yourself? Unmute.
Thank you very much, Suranjan. It's indeed a great honor and a pleasure to be here on the occasion of the release of four volumes. Let me also thank both the Netaji Institute of Asian Studies, you as the Vice Chancellor of Jadavpur University, which has one of the longest standing Department of International Relations. In fact, had almost set up a different school in terms of its thinking on world affairs through the auspices of Jayantajan Bandyopadhyay. And then also the Indian Council for World Affairs and Ambassador T.C.A. Raghavan, who himself is a scholar whose connection to JNU is not just anecdotal. He has a PhD from JNU, but also has written extensively on areas which, from whether it's in terms of the Mughal period or indeed contemporary India-Pakistan relations. I also want to acknowledge the presence particularly of Ambassador Devre, and I was a member of the Governing Council of ICWA when he was the Director General, and we served together in the National Security Advisory Board, the second National Security Advisory Board when Brijesh Mishra was the Principal Secretary. And I think that experience was memorable and particularly educative for me. Ambassador Bhatia pointed out that JNU professors don't need to often read a book to be able to speak on it. I take it as a compliment, particularly in relation to the book that I'm asked to speak on, which is India-Vietnam relations in the emerging global order. Vietnam has been, for several decades, in the consciousness of almost every liberal thinking individual, whether he or she is in JNU or indeed in any academic campus anywhere in the world. The whole idea of NAM still is deeply penetrated in the consciousness of every right-thinking American. And when I say right-thinking, it means the opinion that I respect. And I must have personally actually seen almost every film on Vietnam ever made, and read every book, major book, American book or study on Vietnam. And there's a huge library of books and the manner in which NAM, as I say, impacted on the American consciousness and continues to do so even till today. I thought to be different, I'll also play I play that 10 seconds of music for people to try and identify that music so that I, as a JNU professor, will know whether the collective diplomatic consciousness present in this room is able to identify that music. I suspect that Dr. Raghavan may be able to identify that music. It is, Dr. Raghavan, you can unmute yourself. Unmute yourself.
Could you play it again?
If you play that and anyone identifies it, I promise you I'll get you a book of your choice.
Is it the national anthem?
I wish it was the national anthem, but I'll also play, if you give me a second, I'll play you a more... State government initiative. I'll play you a better version of this, just for a second. Well, you can hear it at your leisure, but this is one of the most important pieces of music which defined American cultural consciousness towards the Vietnam War. It's a classical piece of music which was set as a background to the attack on My Lai in Francis Ford Coppola's magnificent movie Apocalypse Now. The music is The Ride of the Valkyries from Richard Wagner. He's part of the... so this piece of music defines America's understanding of Vietnam. The Ride of the Valkyries, and it's a Wagner piece of music. Wagner is not the most politically correct piece of music, but this is the background to which that massacre at My Lai is set in Coppola's book. But let me get back to the book under question. I think this is a book which is fascinating. It's edited or written by Suranjan Das, Tridib Chakraborti, and Subhadeep Bhattacharya, and I want to congratulate them all for this. I wouldn't call it a primer. I think it's a fundamental text which is essential reading for anyone interested in bilateral relations, because it does cover the whole period from the historical period to the pre-war period, during the troubles in Indochina, to the Cambodian crisis, to finally the whole gamut of contemporary bilateral relations sectorally, whether it's in terms of civil nuclear cooperation, whether it's in terms of human resource development, whether it's in terms of science and technology, culture, geostrategic compulsions. So I must say that anyone interested in India-Vietnam relations, this is an important book to possess, buy, and read. For me, of course, the two most interesting chapters, not surprisingly, are one on Vietnam and West Bengal, and China as a factor in Indo-Vietnam relations. Vietnam in East and West Bengal is remarkable because it draws on history, recovers that period, including Uncle Ho Chi Minh's visit, stopover in Kolkata, and how he attracted a crowd as only you can do in Kolkata of 30,000 people there, all identifying with the struggle in Vietnam, and how, in fact, during that period, or later slightly, I think Ho Chi Minh comes in the late 50s to visit for Nehru and stops in Calcutta. But later on, when you have the Naxalite movement happening in Kolkata, Satyajit Ray, and that's of course referred to in the book anecdotally, produces his trilogy on the Naxalite movement. And one of the great movies which you should all see is Pratidwandi, which is based on a Sunil Gangopadhyay novel. And I have seen it, and it's one of the most impressive Ray movies. And in that, there is this middle-class person who goes for an interview and is rejected because he's asked the question, which do you think is the most significant event, global event of the last decade? Now, people thought he'll say that Mrs. Gandhi's election, or what's happened is Neil Armstrong has landed in the moon in 1969. So everyone expects him to say that Neil Armstrong. He says the Vietnam War. And he doesn't get the job, but Ray makes the point. For me, that movie symbolizes what Vietnam has meant for the Bengalis. And I think Suranjan Da, in his book, also then narrates how important it is for Bengal to become a focal point for, as he has often done in other cases, an really robust Act East policy, especially one that involves Vietnam. I mean, I grew up in the generation post-Vietnam War, but also when even then the fashionable slogan in JNU used to be "Ho Ho Ho Chi Minh, we shall fight, we shall win." But also, in my first class, I was told that Ho Chi Minh told the American delegation which went to visit him that you shall get tired of killing us before we get tired of being killed by you. And that is in some ways symbolic of the fact that Americans may not have lost the war in Vietnam militarily, but lost it politically, and in some ways that was a turning point of the Cold War in Indochina. Pertinently, I think it also, the chapter on China is also one in which there is a great nuance and complexity, particularly in terms of the economic miracle of Vietnam through the late 80s, through these policies of Boi Doi and export-driven economy, and how while Vietnam, like India, or at one stage stronger than India, had great apprehensions about China, and yet they are willing to collaborate, as is the case with Indonesia on the Belt and Road Initiative, with a certain sense of economic pragmatism. If you go to Vietnam, which I have done on a number of occasions, I think the last time only a couple of years ago, you see, in comparison to all the other countries of the Indochina, whether it's Cambodia or whether it's Laos, a vibrant sense of nationalism, a vibrant, resilient spirit of having actually defeated a superpower, but also a great deal of economic success. You can't see poverty, you can see socialism in its most humane sense have an impact in Vietnam, whether it's in terms of education or whether it is in terms of addressing the basic needs of almost all the people in Vietnam, north to the south, from all the various divisions that existed in the hills to the bay. You can see a degree of prosperity which you don't see, not the kind of conspicuous consumption that you see in the capitalist Asian tigers, but a much more peaceful, resilient spirit. I think there is much to learn from Vietnam, and Suranjan Das's book is a fantastic documentation of the history and poses the right questions. And I think, Suranjan Da, now that you're going to stay in Jadavpur for longer, it's important that you focus on the East, develop relations with, this is also looking East in terms of your scholarship. ACT East is actually developing bilateral relations with sister institutions in each one of these countries, together with the Netaji Institute and the ICWA. I'm sure there will be many takers from within India and there. Certainly you can see that many intellectuals in India, through their at least heart and both their head, identify with Vietnam across generations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amitabh, for those stimulating words, and you are always stimulating, and intellectually you are always encouraging, and thank you very much for those words, and we do look forward to receiving your help and guidance in our future academic exercises, where you would like to document India's bilateral relationships with the countries which have been brought under the earlier Lucist and now the Actist policy. Thank you, Amitabh. It is now my very great pleasure to request Mr. Sitaram Sharma, who had been our guiding spirit in developing our discourses on India's relationship with the United Nations, to kindly make his comments. Ms. Sharmaji, could you please unmute yourself? Sharmaji, could you please unmute yourself?
Yeah, okay. It's okay? Now, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, distinguished speakers, before I speak on the United Nations, Professor Mattu reminded us, those who are from Calcutta, our growing days when this Vietnam War was going on. And the most popular slogan in Kolkata was, Tomar Naam, Amar Naam, Vietnam. And I think this was the most popular slogan there in Kolkata during those days. Now you see, I have been a volunteer in the People's Movement for the United Nations. You see, immediately after 1945, when the UN was set up, in 1946, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution that we need people's support. As we all know that the UN Charter begins with the words, "We the peoples," if UN is to survive and work and function. So for that purpose, an organization called World Federation of United Nations Association was set up, and basically to create awareness about the principles and the purposes of the UN. And I have been associated with this World Federation at global level, at the Deputy Secretary General and the Director for the Asia Pacific, national level and the local level. I have been trying to create awareness about the principles and the purposes of the UN. But I've always been telling that we are for the UN, not for the UN bureaucracy. And we have organized programs at one time when UN was almost non-functioning. The UN is dead. So I'm a little pessimistic about United Nations. Ambassador Mukherjee will correct me that the UN has not been as successful as expected. And I still think that it is yet to recover from the damage to its reputation that the second Gulf War inflicted on it. The major challenge, I think, being faced by the United Nations since the millennium is the unilateralism. I also feel, and very strongly feel, that the primacy of the United Nations in the international order is declining, and the global decisions, particularly pertaining to peace and security, are being taken at different levels without any reference to the United Nations. And this is a matter of deep concern. Charter says we the peoples, and what we see, the people's view of the United Nations has been shaken in recent years. Member states are demanding a shift from the talk shop to action, which is missing. In many ways, it is an ailing institution, badly in need of fundamental and bold reforms. Otherwise, it risks declining credibility and its own future will be at risk. It is in real danger of becoming irrelevant, as did the League of Nations. Under the Charter, the UN General Assembly is the main deliberative organ. In fact, our idea was bringing out this compendium was also to emphasize on the role and the importance of the General Assembly, which is normally not accepted or appreciated. We get more concerned about the Security Council. It is the most representative and democratic body of the United Nations. While the decisions of the General Assembly have no legally binding force for the governments, they carry the weight of the world opinion as well as the moral authority of the world community, and which is no less important. There is a deficit in the global governance. We need to revitalize and reform both the General Assembly and the Security Council. There have been some steps, no doubt, towards these. Many committees have been formed, but these have merely scratched the surface and are nowhere near of what is needed in terms of revitalization of the working of the General Assembly. Global cooperation is needed to meet global challenges, and global cooperation calls for global mechanism. So the UN must reform itself, democratize its decision-making body and process. Here I believe the role of the P5, the permanent members, is not very supportive. We all talk about the reforms and the changes in the Security Council and the General Assembly, but we all know that the amendment to the Charter is most difficult process, and it cannot take place unless P5 agree on certain things. I believe the P5 will have to behave and work in a statesman-like leadership, rising above their narrow national interest, and which I find very difficult and has been missing. Now, coming to in our compendium also, we have talked about from 1946 to 2018, and also highlighted the role of India in that context, particularly after the Cold War changing world. And we have also said there that India needs to pursue a proactive policy, UN policy, as a recognized Asian power. And we all know the 21st century has been termed as the Asian century. And India is required to play an important role. I'm not suggesting that India should play a leadership role, which India used to play in 50s of like Korean crisis and all that. That may not be possible, they not be feasible in this changed world situation, because we all know that 2021 is not 1950s. We are fully aware of that. But then at the same time, but India needs to, in a very diplomatic way, because I know after the end of the Cold War, now the relations between the India, America, and China and Russia, they have taken a different shape. So there, India needs to diplomatically articulate its views in non-rhetorical fashion and in lieu of leadership, which I doubt India may get in the United Nations in the near future. Building coalitions and the partnerships on shared goals and interest will be an workable and easy option. It will be in India's interest to see the United Nations succeeds, because we know that there is no alternative to the United Nations, and a reformed United Nations is the best guarantor of the world peace and development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sharma, for highlighting the much needed reforms within the United Nations structure. And as we all know, India has been consistently demanding such changes. I'm sure later on, if there is time, Ambassador Ashok Mukherjee might highlight for our benefit what could these reforms be. Could I now request our colleague Sarvani Gooptu to make some comments, some remarks about particularly the book that you have edited along with Vivek, and also if you want to make comments on some associated themes. Sarvani, please.
Thank you, Professor Suranjan Das, the director of my institute. Thank you to Ambassador Raghavan of the Indian Council of World Affairs for giving me this opportunity of being a part of this elite panel. Thank you, Ambassador Bhatia, for very well dealing with this book that we edited. Vivek, this is actually Vivek's favorite topic. But he roped me in because I have always been interested in looking at the historical pasts of this present. And today that is exactly what I'm going to talk about, rather than the book, which I know Vivek will give much better details than I will be able to do. But in the formulation of any strategy by any country, ignoring the life force of the nation, which is the people and their values, could lead to pitfalls and misguided judgments, sometimes with catastrophic effect. One often needs to look beyond the present reality and rummage in the dusty archives of the past for clues to negotiate the morass of conflicting national interests, as well as locating unfinished experiments in the past, which could provide a blueprint for the future. Political strategy for regional cooperation refers to the dictionary meaning to the political and institutional mechanisms that countries in a general geographical region devise to find and strengthen common interests, as well as promoting their national interests through mutual cooperation and dialogue. The easiest way of establishing commonalities in order to ensure stability of cooperation, regional cooperation, identification of common historical past and memories of interaction, but with the caveat the tenuous and fragile bonds that the heads of the nations establish can be strengthened through memories of people-to-people interaction. Colonial rule, despite its noxious impact on the political and economic life of the colonized, aided the spontaneous desire of the colonized to use the tools of communication, that is road and water transport, to explore their neighboring countries in the quest of knowing them better. For the past few years, I have been trying to assess how newspapers and literary journals took the initiative to establish meaningful knowledge base among its readers about the countries of Asia, educating the Bengali reader about the specialities and values of different countries in the first half of the 20th century. This coincided with similar aspirations of Asian intellectuals, many of them, including Okakura and Rabindranath Tagore, and many others from the different Asian countries who were committed to playing a role in leading Asia to a new and more just world while strengthening the solidarity among Asian nations. The argument of the intellectuals of this period has been reflected in the vernacular journals. That was that ancient cultural preeminence that India had established in other Asian countries through religious, political and cultural explorations could be replicated even in the 20th century when the political element would be disregarded and cultural give and take would reinforce connectivity. Thus, on this harmonious ground, a strong network of countries of Asia would be created, connected by cultural ties and a common historical past as a weapon against colonialism. This united front would be formidable and yet would be free from chauvinism that plagued nationalism. The ideological movement through the journals to look beyond boundaries for friendship was both political and spiritual, nationalistic and cosmopolitan. I have written a book on this recently. It's about to be published from Routledge. I'm calling it Knowing Asia, Being Asian. This idea of linking of populations against colonialism still remains relevant today and can take on a new meaning while determining present strategies. Creating congeniality by using cultural tropes, relevant cultural tropes, which could unify populations by appealing to universal interests like music, dance, cinema, theatre, art, transnational literature, and even non-confrontational socio-religious meetings, fairs, and most important of all, facilitating tourism would be the surest way of guaranteeing warmth amongst peoples, a strategy worth pursuing along with the political and the military. One of the most significant and successful examples in this regard is the history of the establishment of Bodh Gaya as a center of religious and cultural meeting point, promoting heritage and tourism through movement of populations of the world. A pilgrimage in the true sense, a means to understand the life force of civilizations. As Tagore put it, a rare sharing and exchange of knowledge and cultural values, highlighting the importance of value-based affect in shaping of national and foreign policies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarvani, for taking us back to historical times, the role history can play in shaping relationship even in contemporary period. The link between the past and the present, you have wonderfully outlined. Vivek, do we take some questions? Vivek?
Sir, there aren't any questions, but if the panelists have something to say to wrap up, I think that's welcome.
Okay, if we have a wrap-up session, can we start with Ambassador Mukherjee, please?
Thank you, Suranjan. It was for me a very educative panel discussion, and I'm really thankful to my senior colleagues, Ambassadors Dev Ray and Rajiv Bhatia, for their remarks, and of course to Professor Mattu. We have not met personally, but we have many common friends in the Foreign Service who look up to you. So thank you very much for what you have said. I would like to just make 2 or 3 points with reference to what Dr. Sitaram Sharma said, and I think that what he said was very important. And this whole focus on we the peoples and the work of the United Nations associations is so important that I must confess, and in this setting, that I was a bit hamstrung in New York when I did not get any echo of this voice from India during the negotiations we undertook on sustainable development. There was no Indian presence, corporate or civil society or youth or anybody in those 2.5 years. And that, in a sense, made me think that we need to do something about it. And I'm glad that Dr. Sharma has proposed some courses of action. I would just like to say two things in that. One is, of course, the big issue which me and my colleagues and everybody talk about, the reform of the Security Council. And as Dr. Sharma has put it, without the P5, this reform seems to be very difficult to get. Although, to be a devil's advocate, I must say that in 1963 December, 4 of the P5 opposed the reform of the Security Council through amending the Charter, and yet by a majority of 2/3, mainly developing countries, we were able to amend the Charter through a resolution, and eventually all 5 of the permanent members agreed with that resolution, and it was implemented from 1965 onwards. So that's the history. But the point that I think I would like to conclude with is bringing back the focus to we the peoples. And it's not only the relevance, the action of the United Nations, which has been mentioned by Dr. Sharma, but also the future. And I think that we need, therefore, to really combine our energies in pushing for the implementation of Article 109 of the UN Charter, which requires the convening of a general conference. And the hurdle or the bar for a decision on this is very low. It's a simple majority of the General Assembly and 7 out of the 15 members of the Security Council. There is no veto since it's not a Security Council item. So I think if we could channelize our energies towards convening a general conference of the United Nations, it would be a very, very important step towards meeting all those objectives which you have pointed to, Dr. Sharma. And if the United Nations associations in India could activate themselves in a coherent and coordinated manner, using links with the ICWA, for example, and also with the Indian universities, because this is where it has to come from. It has to come from the groundswell of young public opinion. And of course, it has to also go into the corporate world. But we need this mass movement, and the paradigm shift has happened. And that's what I'd like to point out. The concept of multiple stakeholders participating in United Nations General Assembly negotiations has happened with sustainable development. It is happening with cyber issues, digital technologies. These are facts. In India, we don't talk of it, but these are facts that are happening internationally. And our voice is lost in the process. And that, I think, will enable us to play that leadership role that you talked of, which is to create our own constituency, sharing our development experiences, sharing our perspectives. The amount of interest there is in the Indian experience is incredible outside India. But somehow we seem to not fulfill this expectation when we project ourselves as India abroad. So thank you for this opportunity to make these points. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Ambassador Devar, would you like to come in and make some comments? Ambassador Devari, could you please unmute yourself?
Yeah. Am I audible now?
Yes, yes.
Thank you very much. It has been very productive and educative. I learned from fellow panelists a lot, different diverse subjects. My only point that I want to raise or highlight here is both ICWA and NIAS have focused on challenges before Asia. We all very well know the role which ICWA played at the time the Asian Relations Conference and later on. NIAS also on Asian history. Today, I think Asia is again faced with formidable challenges. And I think it is time that, we need not take on the entire agenda. It might be too wide. But even if a few challenges, few problems which Asia faces are identified, and similar exercise is conducted on a wider scale, of course, that could be a very important and useful input for the government as well as for the society as a whole, because I think today we cannot allow ourselves to distract from these major problems that Asia has, be it political, strategic, economic, or socio-cultural. That is my humble suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Devare. Ambassador Bhatia, would you like to come in?
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. I'll just take 2 or 3 minutes to make a concrete suggestion to all these leaders and senior managers of the point I'm making is that for the Indian Ocean and Indo-Pacific, the past 3-year period has been quite a transforming period, 2017 to 2021. China challenge has become much more serious, and the West has also now become far more clear about the nature and complexity of this challenge. 2018 is when India presented its vision of the Indo-Pacific, which was still inclusive as articulated by Prime Minister Modi at the ASEAN summit. But the very next year in 2019, India took the decision to walk out of RCEP. And then in March 2020, the COVID era began, and it began along with the fresh and serious problems in India-China relations, resulted in the Galwan conflict, and we know the whole story of complete impasse in the negotiations, which have not given any cause of happiness or comfort to India. And now the Indian view is open that India-China relationship stands at a crucial juncture. And it is in this light we saw how quickly the Quad caravan moved forward. The first summit took place, and now we are in the middle of preparations for the preparatory foreign ministers' discussions, resulting in the first in-person summit in Washington that will further refine the strategy to deal with the China challenge. And while India has made up its mind to be part of the Forum of Democracies, the fact remains that while for us China is a danger, it's a threat, China is an adversary, but for the West, China is still seen as a competitor or at best a challenge, not an adversary, not a threat. And therefore, when Vivek and Sarvani talk about, that dilemma, there is a little bit of merit there as well. My conclusion and takeaway, Chair, is that in the history of international relations, sometimes even a 3-year period is a very long period. And while I know, having worked in ICWA, the pressure under which our research fellows work, I think we need to look at our procedures so that when the conference takes place, then its conclusions, its papers really need to be converted into a book faster. That could have a much bigger and greater impact. Otherwise, later our young scholars end up spending a lot of time trying to catch up and try to make the book up to date, and sometimes they may still not succeed because events have moved so fast. So it is true that the journalists cannot get a full handle on the unfolding story, but for scholars it is even more difficult because they work on a different time lag. So my request and my suggestion is that we need to keep this time factor in mind, particularly at this stage when the drama is really unfolding at bewildering pace. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Bhatia. Amitabh, would you like to make some comments?
I'll just make two comments, Suranjan. One is, I think when you update this volume, you could consider adding a chapter, apropos what Ambassador Bhatia also said, on public health collaboration. Now, as you might know, when the first wave of the pandemic happened, the virus traveled to Vietnam. One of the first countries after China which experienced or identified the COVID virus was Vietnam. Yet Vietnam, through its absolutely fantastic network of facilities, institutions, doctors, paramedics, was able to control by tracing, quarantining, and treating patients. The second wave is now a little more variable. But even then, I think Vietnam offers a model of public health collaboration. Second point which I wanted to make was that I don't know how many people are aware that amongst the first time that India was sanctioned by the United States, the 480 program to shift to North policy was because of India's stand against the Vietnam War. That historical background, of course, in India's case, it turned out to be a blessing in disguise. That helped create the momentum for the Green Revolution. Let me stop there. There's an echo which is coming in. I suspect there might be one more microphone which is on. But these two, public health and the historical bonding of the Vietnam War and how that India actually faced consequences beyond the realist paradigm, actually took a stand against the Vietnam War, faced sanctions by initially the Lyndon Johnson administration, of course, later on continued with those sanctions.
Thank you, Amitabh. Thank you, Amitabh, for those comments. We'll certainly keep them in mind. We had hinted at the hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah, we had hinted at the implications of India's stand against the Vietnam War, but we need to elaborate it, and we'll certainly take that point forward. And also for the general benefit of the panel, Ambassador Bhatia mentioned about the Asian challenge. We need to develop more discourses on the Asian challenge. You'll be happy to know that myself and Vivek have started working on the post-COVID Indian diplomacy in the Asian context. And that would perhaps also take care of the very important point that Amitabh made and also the point of Asian challenge that Rajiv Bhatia made. And we do look forward to publish that volume within 2-3 months, which could provide a new entry point of developing a new discourse on Asian cooperation. And in that context, whether multilateral process is important or bilateral process is important in combating a challenge like the pandemic challenge. Mr. Sitaram Sharma, would you like to come in? Can you unmute yourself? Mr. Sharma, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, I have done. I hope now you can hear me. It was a very interesting discussion, particularly regarding the United Nations. And Ambassador Mukherjee made very important contribution. And I think in India also, the people's movement for the UN needs to be strengthened. And there, I think ICWA can also play a very important role along with the UN associations. And where, you know, that particularly on the reforms, because I think when this in the UN when it was decided to fill Shashi Tharoor for the post of the Secretary General, and we all knew that he will not win, and still we continued with that. And similarly, we also know that we will not have a seat in the Security Council, and which was, I think, we took it up. India will be in the Security Council not because of anybody's bidding. India will be in the Security Council when times come. And I think these are the issues we need to raise and discuss and deliberate on those issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sarvani, would you like to come in? Sarvani?
Oh, thank you, Suranjan.
Okay,
I
okay.
don't have it.
Okay. Dr. Raghavan, would you like to make some comments on the discussion that we had?
Well, I would like to say that it was a very rich discussion, and I was particularly interested in what Dr. Gooptu said about this idea of Asianism. And of course, this is a subject which at one stage was worked upon a great deal, but somehow it never acquired the traction which it should have. And I feel sometimes that there was a intrinsic flaw in our approach to Asianism, and this was most evident in the case of Southeast Asia, because although it was principally a scholarly movement and a fraternity of scholars, the scholarship which emerged out of the Greater India Society had a kind of dampening effect in terms of the decolonized countries of Southeast Asia looking at India, because they saw it as condescending, somewhat a parochial Indian view to substitute our influence for those of the departing colonial powers. And somehow I think we were not sensitive enough about that. So whenever I hear discourses about Asianism, I'm always curious to know to what extent we have corrected that perspective. To my mind, I don't think we have sufficiently corrected our own approach and our own perspective. For instance, in any number of seminars and conferences which are held on the contacts between India and Southeast Asia in the first millennium AD, and there's a rich scholarship which has developed around that, not just in India but around elsewhere in the world. But we seldom talk about the fact that Islam in fact went to Southeast Asia from India. You know, we take the Indian cultural contact ending with the end of the first millennium, and somehow that has an impact on Southeast Asian countries. And Ambassador Devre referred to the puzzle of India-Indonesia relations, and to some extent the puzzle in India-Malaysia relations. I think these factors also have to be taken note of. This was just some thoughts which came to my mind. Thank you very much. It was a very rich and very enriching discussion, and I'm grateful to all the panelists for having joined us today.
Thank you.
Can I just say one word in reply? So the book that I have written is actually slightly different from the academic work that was done by the Greater India Society. So the work in the articles in the vernacular journals, vernacular literary journals, which was actually talking to the readers, created a kind of a separate movement of knowing Asia. And though there are these problems, the stereotypical problems of chauvinism, which is very connected to nationalism, but if you read between the lines, the desire to know Asia and how they are a part of it can be brought out. I hope you will read my book when it comes up.
Thank you, Dr. Raghavan. I only hope that today's session would be a new entry point for greater collaboration between ICWA and the various educational institutions based in West Bengal. Not only Netaji Institute, but Jadavpur, Kolkata, Calcutta universities, other universities, because I strongly feel, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, that regional voices need to make their presence felt in the national capital in the realm of Indian foreign policy. That is the true federal spirit. And that federal spirit needs to be sustained, and ICWA has been playing a very important role in reaching out to the various universities. I hope the process continues. Thank you very much, Dr. Raghavan, for helping us in organizing this panel. We now come to the end of the session, and could I request Vivek Mishra to make concluding remarks and move a formal vote of thanks.
Thank you, sir. Thank you everybody for your thoughts and comments. I think we're well past the time, so I'll reserve my comments, except saying that thank you, Professor Ambassador Bhatia, for your interesting comments. I think we were always playing the catching up game, because it was a post-conference compilation. But I'm happy to share that an international version of this book, a publication of this book, is coming out by Routledge, where we are amending all these critical gaps in the literature. So thank you so much, everybody. Also, we are also connecting the whole discourse of the strategy in the IOR to the Indo-Pacific in the new version. So with that, let me move to the vote of thanks on behalf of the Indian Council of World Affairs. I thank all chair, the panelists, and the listeners for joining us today and offering us valuable thoughts on these publications. Thank you, Chair Professor Suranjan Das, for chairing today's session and for your initial idea for holding this joint book release. Thank you, panelists, Ambassador Mukherjee, Ambassador Devre, Ambassador Bhatia, Professor Mattu, Sri Sitaram Sharma, and Professor Gooptu for taking out your valuable time and your comments on the book. My sincere thanks to the Director General of the Indian Council of the World Affairs for agreeing to host this discussion and for releasing the books. My thanks also to ICWA administration led by Deputy Director General Somen Bakshi and Joint Secretary Nutan Mahavar. Many thanks to all my colleagues at ICWA, led by the Director of Research, Dr. Nivedita Ray, whose support was critical in putting this program together. And lastly, sincere thanks to the IT section in the ICWA, the designer, and Joint Secretary's office for coordinating this program. We also requested to join us for another fascinating book discussion on July 7th at the same time, 3:30 p.m. This book is a perspective, the book in perspective is the Indian Civil Service and Indian Foreign Policy, 1923 to 1961, by Dr. Amit Das Gupta, a senior researcher based in Germany. With this, I formally declare this program closed. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.